for you guys, we actually finished the slide, but we're gonna go back and just so we could take things from the beginning here, because like I said, what we're talking about today is how plants reproduce using flowers. And so we'll talk about the parts. So when you look at a flower, you have the green parts that are sort of underneath the flower. If you imagine like a rose. If you have a rose, you have the green stem of the rose, and then at the bottom there's some leaves that sort of the flower actually sits in. The green parts, those leaves, those are the sepals, okay? And most flowers have those sepals. Okay, they help to protect the flower. They're sort of more durable than the petals of the flower. And then the petals are there. You know, they have different jobs. Sometimes they're to attract animals, to attract what we call pollinators. Okay, pollinators are an important part of plant reproduction, and many plants rely on other animals to transport pollen from flower to flower. We also said that the flower of a plant has the reproductive structures in there, and they have the reproductive cells. All organisms that reproduce sexually have what we call gametes. In animals, we call the gametes the sperm cell and the egg cell. In plants, we call them different. We have different terms for them. The male gamete in a plant we call pollen. A pollen grain is equivalent to a sperm cell in an animal. In an animal, we call it an egg cell, which is in the female. In the flower, we call it the ovule. But they're basically very similar. They are called gametes. They're reproductive cells. And in order to produce an offspring, you need the combination of a male and a female gamete. In plants, it's a pollen or an ovule. When they combine, their genetic material merges, and then fertilization has happened. So that's a form of sexual reproduction in plants. It requires two different parents. Right? We know that it's part of sexual reproduction. We know that when the offspring grow, they have traits, characteristics from both of the parents. Because some of their genes came from one parent and some came from the other. So they have a mixture of traits, characteristics. But plants also can reproduce asexually. There's a lot of different ways that plants can do this. But here you have an example of, when this was growing out of the ground, it looked like there were 4 separate plants. One growing here, one here, one here, one here. But actually, they all came from the same original plant because the root grew underground and sent up shoots that grew into individual plants. Again, there was no mixing of genes. This plant is identical to these plants as well because they all came from one parent cell. If you have, for example, a really great tomato plant in your garden, it has great tomatoes, it grows healthy, they taste good, you could actually snip off a branch from that tomato plant, put it in some water or some soil, and the base of that branch will actually start growing roots, and that will grow into its own tomato plant. But was there any combining of genes? No, you just took a branch and made it its own organism. That would be an example of asexual reproduction. Okay? We're going to mostly talk about the sexual reproduction in plants. And when you look at a flower, now there's different types of flowers. Sometimes, I think you skip a slide here, right? Yeah, we'll get back to that. And some plants, there are male flowers and other flowers are female flowers. On some plants, you have both male and female reproductive parts in one single flower. Some plants, even, a whole plant only has male flowers, and a separate type of that plant would have only female flowers. So there's all sort of different configurations there of male and female parts.
On the female, it says pistil instead of color.
Yeah, we'll have to figure that out. So we'll just go through this one at a time.
Can all plants reproduce sexually or asexually?
Yes. Yep. All right, so let's talk about the male reproductive organs in a flower. If you ever, you could see the different parts. If you ever had a bouquet of flowers or large flowers like a tulip or something, they're very obvious to see the different parts. You know, if you're looking at a smaller flower, sometimes they're not so obvious. But if you look closely, you'll see these parts. So the male reproductive parts are called the stamen. And the stamen is made of two parts, the anther and the filament. The anther is at the tip of the filament. It's kind of usually oval shaped. If you look at it very closely, it's sort of has a rough texture because that anther is where the pollen grains form, the male gamete. It's on the tip of each of these anthers. And the filament is like this little stalk that holds the anther up inside of the flower. So those are the male parts of a flower. And their job really is just to produce these pollen grains, these gametes, these reproductive cells. Generally in the center of a flower are the female reproductive parts. Okay, sometimes it's called the pistil, or the carpel is another term for it. Okay, so they're interchangeable. Okay, that's the female reproductive organs. So you write in carpel there underneath pistil. You could write it in parentheses or something. And so here we have the carpel or the pistil, this little structure that's in the center. Okay, what it has is at the very top, part called the stigma, and its job is to collect pollen. So in order for fertilization to happen, that stigma has to get a pollen grain on it. Okay. The style supports the stigma, keeps it up there. And then down in the base of the carpel is the ovary. And the ovary is where these little female gametes are, these ovules, these female sex cells. Hello? I don't know what the technical term for it. I think we just talked about it. I don't know. So those are the female parts, and then just in that ovary are the ovules, the tiny little egg cells. Those are the female parts. And so obviously, for sexual reproduction in plants, you need both parts. You need the female parts to gather the pollen so that fertilization can take place. So again, let's look at some other pictures that show us these parts. This looks like a lily. Okay. So again, have the sepal, the green parts. Yeah, this is just a separate picture. Okay. Then we've reorganized some of the notes. Then we have the petals of the plant. Okay. Colorful petals, which often attract pollinators. The male parts of the plant, again, we have on these are the filaments, these stalks, and at the end are the anthers, okay, these little parts that produce pollen. Here in the middle, we have the carpel, or the pistil, the female reproductive organs. We have the stigma at the top, 2 is called the style, and then the ovary down here which holds the egg cells, the ovules. Those are the parts of a flower. So we can look at some examples here. What part is this?
Oh, it's the thing that holds it,
Yeah?
no, the filament.
No, that's the sepal. These are individual flowers.
Yeah.
Okay?
Wait,
So those are the sepals, this outer ring of leaves.
where did we write this?
You don't have to write it.
Okay.
And we have the petals, obviously, colorful, the sepals and petals. They're modified leaves, really. They often have different pigments in them, though, that give them their color. Okay. So sepal, these bottom leaves, petals are these upper leaves. And flowers develop and open at different times depending on the season and so forth, when pollinators will be around. And then inside of the petals are where the reproductive structures are, the male and female reproductive structures. So if we look at these flowers, obviously we have the petals here. Okay. What would you call these things?
Oh, no, it's.
There's several of them. What? Anther. What do we call these stalks that they're on?
The filament,
Filaments. What would we call this whole thing?
the pistil,
The
or
plant.
carpel.
Pistil or carpel?
Carpel.
Yes. All right. So this is a tulip. Again, what are these?
The stamen.
Those are the stamen. The tip of it is called the anther. The stalk is
Filament.
the filament. Okay. What do we call this whole thing? The
Carpel.
carpel. What do we call the landing platform for the pollen grains?
The stigma.
Yes, the stigma. Again, another lily, another good picture here. So we can see here, what are these?
The stamen.
Those are the stamen. Okay, the anthers and the filaments. What is this part of?
The carpel.
This is the carpel. The tip is called
The stigma.
the tube.
Oh, that's the style.
And then way at the base, which we can't see, the ovary. Again, so now you've seen all these flowers probably. Okay. Again, here you see the various anthers, and in the middle, okay, we can see the carpel, stigma, and all those parts.
How many?
Lots. So you get the idea?
Yeah.
Anthers, pistil, male, female, reproductive parts.
Oh.
Okay, again, when we look at these parts here, yep. In the female carpel, it's the innermost parts. In the center, has the ovules, which are in the base. Those become seeds. Each of those ovules, if they are fertilized, will eventually mature into a seed. The stigma up here is the sticky end of the pistil that collects pollen. The male parts, the anther, which produces the pollen, and then the pollen itself, you can see it kind of floating through the air here. Those are the male gametes. So pollination is the process by which pollen from the male parts of a flower are spread onto the female parts of another flower. Okay? So pollen's transferred from the anther to the stigma. Now you might think, well, yeah, that's easy. The pollen just drops off and then it's right there. It's on the stigma, easy. But that's not the way it usually happens. If this pollen grain lands on this stigma, is that sexual reproduction?
No.
Why would you say no?
Because it's not including two different.
Right, because it's just coming from one single parent. It's a pollen grain from one parent fertilizing an egg cell from the same parent. So technically, there could be some variation because of some genetic things that we will not get into, but usually plants don't self-pollinate. Usually what happens is what we call cross-pollination. That pollen from one plant fertilizes a different plant. That's called cross-pollination. Transfer of pollen from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another. And again, just like in animals, they have to be the same species. Okay, in that a maple tree will only fertilize another maple tree, can't fertilize another plant. Just like within a single animal species, reproduction happens just within the members of that species. So this would be an example of self-pollination. Okay, when a pollen grain from the anther fertilizes its own flower. Cross-pollination would be when that pollen grain is transferred to another plant for fertilization. And cross-pollination is important because what is one of the key things we need for evolution? Sort of the first stage.
Like things so you can adapt.
Yeah, and so if we have a species, when each member of the species is identical to each other, would any one of them be better adapted than another if they're all identical? No. We need to start with variation. There needs to be differences between individuals. And many of those variations come through sexual reproduction. If we review natural selection, we start with variation. There have to be differences. Then there's that struggle for survival. Some individuals, because of their variations, can survive better than others, and therefore they survive and can reproduce, passing on those traits to the next generation, leading to adaptations over time. So an important benefit of sexual reproduction is that it produces variation. In species that reproduce sexually, there's much more variation than in species that produce asexually. So it's an advantage in plants to have cross-pollination for those individuals to cross-pollinate each other. And there's different ways that we will talk about of how plants encourage cross-pollination versus self-pollination. But for now, we're going to stop there.